This is the first book I remember reading to myself, and I remembered the title and remembered the book, but I didn't have the book anymore. And after I told an audience about this one day, it was an audience of librarians, somebody sent me this book because it was being discarded from the library. But what I remember, interestingly, is my mother had read this book to me. So I knew the story, but when I sat down and realized I could read it for myself, I could see for the first time how funny our language is. I could see that the PH was odd. I thought it should be an F because I knew how F's sounded. But being 3, 4 years old, you just accept the way things are. Okay, Humphrey is spelled with a PH. And then very soon I saw that telephone on our telephone book was also spelled that way. I have a granddaughter who grew up and learned to read in Germany. Germany is spelled exactly the way it sounds. And she still, though she reads and speaks English, thinks that German is a more logical language. I think she's right. This, of course, is what happened in Honolulu in 1941. The planes that came in and bombed Pearl Harbor came around the island, across the island, right over the house in which I had spent my earliest years. But by then, we were gone. My father had been transferred to New York, and we were living in New York on this day, December 7th, 1941. And I remember that day. I was 4 years old. I remember, it was a Sunday, of course, my father was outside, about to get into our car, when I ran out. I think Mother was coming behind me, but I was the one who called to him and said, "Daddy, Mama says you have to come in and put your uniform on." She heard something on the radio. I've never gone to check and see, but apparently it must have been announced with the announcement of this tragedy at Pearl Harbor. They must have said men in the military must be in uniform, because my father on a Sunday was in civilian clothes. And it was my mother who said, "Bob, come back and put your uniform on." Me finally starting school. In those days, little girls wore dresses to school, hair ribbons, and apparently we carried little purses as well. And in New York, my father was Norwegian. This is my last name at that time, Hammersburg, Norwegian name. In New York, children were given identification tags. Most of them were tin, the way soldiers wore ID tags around their necks, and my father had his as well. But my father had my sisters and mine made out of gold, and I still have mine. And the reason, of course, though I wouldn't have known it then, was they thought that New York would be bombed, and these tags were to identify our bodies, I suppose. It's now on a bracelet. It's a bracelet I never wear because in the lower left is my ex-husband's fraternity pin. I should have saved that bit of information for the adult speech. This is my father at the time of the beginning of World War II. My father was a very fine photographer, though that wasn't his profession. He was a dental surgeon. But I remember in our New York apartment in Brooklyn, I remember my father putting his camera on a tripod and taking this picture of himself, and then he enlarged it, and my mom framed it, and we had it during the war. I've always loved this picture because I think I later became a photographer myself, and I think a good portrait shows more than what a face looks like. It shows what the person is inside, and I think you can see in my father's face his concern for his family and for the whole world at the beginning of World War II. He knew he would soon be going off to war. My baby brother had just been born, and my mother, he actually was born after my mother took us back to Pennsylvania, to the place where her parents lived. And my brother was born there, and then my father went overseas to the Pacific and was gone for several years. But this is where I began first grade. I later wrote a book called Autumn Street. It isn't here today, but it's one of my favorites. And in that book, the little girl begins first grade. And it's written in the first person. And it describes my sister taking me to my first day of school, which was true. Small town, mom's home with a new baby, and so my sister is the one that takes me for my very first day of school and describes that in the book. And it describes the teacher at the first grade room who knelt down beside me and showed me books to read and showed me a desk where I could sit while she waited for the other children. And who said to me, "Did you come all alone on the very first day?" And it says, "Yes, I lied." My sister had already gone upstairs to fourth grade. But anyway, after that book was published, somebody gave my first grade teacher, who was by then, she had gone on to become a professor of reading and was now retired, and somebody gave her a copy of the book and told her that that was she in the book. I had changed her name slightly. And she wrote me a letter. She said she was pleased to be remembered so fondly by a former student. And then her second paragraph broke my heart. She said, "In all honesty, I don't remember you at all." I had thought for all those years, it had been 40 years or so, that I had been her best little student ever. But I realized too that probably every kid going through that classroom had, for the subsequent years, thought they were her favorite. Oh, this is the book I was talking about. It's not a book for kids. I mean, it's published as a young adult book. And the child in the book, who's me. At the panel earlier, for those of you who were there, people were talking about book jackets, book covers. This is the paperback, and they showed me a copy of this before it was finally printed. And they had the little girl with very dark hair. And I wrote and said, you know, it's not important to the reader, but the child in the book is me, and I was so blonde. Is it too late to change her hair? And actually they were able to do that, so her hair has been changed to blonde. But it is about the child during World War II with her father gone. It's about loss and about the murder of a childhood friend who here is portrayed as a little boy. It was actually a girl in real life, and I changed it to a boy for the book. But this is the book that meant the most to me in my childhood. My mother read it to me when I was 8. She read it to my sister and me starting out. My sister would have been 11. Bedrooms beside each other. Mother sat in the hall. We were in our beds. Our rooms were dark, and I could see the light coming down over Mother's shoulder while she read. And within a chapter or two, my sister said, "Boring," and she went back to Nancy Drew or Cherry Ames or whatever she was reading. And so it was my mother and me together for this book. I'll show you in a minute. I think there's a picture here that will show you why I related so well to this book. Yes, that's me on the road. Power off. Help. Help, tech person. Press any other button. Okay. This book was published for adults. I think now you could probably find it in the young adult section of bookstores. But it's about a boy, and he lives in the swamps of Florida, swampland, on a very poor farm. And it's a book of, it's a tragic story in many ways. But I made myself into that boy when I listened to that story. I just became this boy, Jody, and this book was so important to me. Not long ago, there was an article in the New York Times about children's books, and they called me to get a quote. And they wanted to know what book had been very important to me in my childhood, and I mentioned this book. So when that was published, I got an email from Catherine Patterson. You know that name? Mm-hmm. And she's a writer of wonderful children's books. But she emailed me and she said, "The Yearling was my book. You can't have it. It's my important book." And I wrote back and I said, this was cruel. I said, "Did you have the copy with the N.C. Wyeth illustrations?" And she wrote back and she said, "No, we were very poor. Our copy didn't have illustrations." So I said, "Well, I'll send you one." And I scanned my favorite painting from the book. Not this one, a different one, a real tearjerker. And I emailed it to Catherine, and she replied, "Thank you, now I'm crying."